Em nome do programa de pós-graduação em Projetos do Patrimônio da Faculdade de
University of Rio de Janeiro School of Architecture and Urban Planning Postgraduate Program for Projects and Heritage, I'd like to welcome you all to the last roundtable for the Transnational Dialogues 2022. This session will have simultaneous translation. To listen in English, Spanish, or Portuguese as you wish, click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen and choose your language. Transnational Dialogues are a series of roundtables promoted by the new Heritage Approaches team since November 2020 as part of the Our World Heritage activities to promote mutual listening, community engagement, and exchange of knowledge and experiences in order to improve and strengthen the actions for preserving and conserving cultural and natural heritage. Throughout 2021, 134 meetings were held involving global discussions divided into 12 monthly themes. The new heritage approaches, was held in June 2021 and had 24 sessions. The playlist with all sessions in this webinar can be accessed by YouTube on the link made available in the chat room. The 2022 dialogues aim to celebrate the 50-year anniversary of the World Heritage Convention and focus especially on Article 5, which talks about the need for world natural and cultural heritage to perform a function in communities' everyday lives. Our intention is to provoke this debate under a more egalitarian and inclusive perspective involving many narratives of the many cultural actors in their diverse contexts to together try to build a less segregated world and less hegemonic world of what is considered heritage. The roundtables throughout 2022 focus on three everyday forces: arts, food, and housing, as attempts to incorporate and transform heritage, daily heritage, experienced by communities and vice versa, questioning ideology, discourses, and colonialism practices. Today's roundtable, the last one in this cycle, is called Cities, Housing, and Heritage: Social Conflict, Citizenship, and Well-Being. And the objective is to reflect on the role and the place of heritage in contemporary cities, focusing on the reutilization of heritage that is edified and public spaces as a collective territory for exchanges and experiences in order to adapt to the needs of future and present generations, in order to face discourses and practices of colonialism which still permeate conservation, heritage conservation policies. We understand that decolonizing means embracing multiple perspectives and narratives from different cultural players in their many contexts. The conservation of heritage becomes a synonym for decolonization, as it is able to promote equity and justice through the coexistence and dialogue among the many social segments without considering the diversity of ethnicities and race, which form and act on the current social and cultural tissue of society. To face dynamics which consolidate metropolis as a fractured and segregated space through meeting and exchanging ideas becomes then the only path possible. Today's debate is inserted in the discussions on new approaches on heritage as part of the activities in the Our World Heritage Movement. Is promoted by the Professional Masters Projects in Projects and Heritage from FAO-UEFRJ, the Hybrid Landscape Group from the Fine Arts School of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, the Institute of Architects of Brazil, and the Council of Architecture and Urban Planning of the State of Rio de Janeiro, supported by the Cultural Preservation Center from the University of São Paulo, the Group for Studies and Research in Politics and Territory, and the International Council for Architects of Portuguese Language, the Cultural Heritage Center from the Universidad Católica de Chile, and the Latin American Forum for Environmental Sciences. I now give the floor to Maria Elisa Batista, President of the Institute of Architects of Brazil, for a brief greeting on behalf of our partners. Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon. I'd like to greet you all who built these transnational dialogues. I'd like to acknowledge our speakers today. And as usual, I'd like to thank Monica, who gathered us here, and once again talk about how happy the IAB, the Institute of Architects of Brazil, is to be here with you. These are necessary dialogues, showing experiences, responding, answering to our urgent questions in Brazil, a country with a predominantly urban population, but with cities that are absurdly unequal and enormous losses of heritage, not just built, but also cultural and environmental. Living is a universal concept, and that is how we build our societies. And these modes restructure our culture, our priorities, and our relationships. Housing is a right which is for in Brazilian constitution, but what we see in the streets of our cities totally contradicts this national agreement, which has never actually been a reality. Housing is not merchandise, which needs to be in urban areas with access, infrastructure, offer of health, education, culture, safety, and culture structures. It should be totally aesthetic and available to all. We, all family groups, should be able to access this, especially children and the elderly. Children who live in healthy environments that are comfortable and beautiful have much greater chances to develop intellectually and in terms of health. Now her microphone is off.
Desculpa, Maria Elisa,
Maria Lisa, your microphone is off.
você pode ativar
Your
novamente.
microphone has become muted. Oh, I think it's back on now.
Não,
Sorry, I don't know how that happened. I don't know where that was. Okay, so I'll just move on. So the conditions for housing also create a dependency of all family groupings, conditions, especially children and the elderly. Children who live in healthy, safe, comfortable, and beautiful houses have a much greater chance for psychic, motor, and intellectual full development. Quality housing affords the chance for interconnection, creativity. To guarantee housing in adequate areas will greatly reduce the impact on preservation areas of water supply and cultural areas. Of course, we need museums, cultural centers, theaters, but we need even more for all people to live well so that they can enjoy all this. Public policies which guarantee the use of housing, the housing use of our urban heritage are essential for democracy. Finally, beauty humanizes us. A city where everyone lives with dignity is a beautiful city, a city that builds peace and houses love. For that reason, maybe in times of struggle, today's theme is so important. A country where everyone can live in dignity and enjoy culture and let it flourish. In the next few days in Brazil, we will like to bet all our chips on resisting catastrophes which we may face. May these dialogues help us to build a better world for us all. Thank you very much.
Muitíssimo obrigada, Maria Elisa, pelas
Thank
palavras
you, Maria Elisa,
pelo
for
convite.
your very timely
Vou
words.
passar então agora a apresentar
I
a
now I
moderadora
will now
Noêmia Barradas.
introduce
Obrigada, Maria Elisa.
our moderators, Noemia Bahadas and Flavia Brito. Noemia is an architect and graduated from the Bennett Methodist Institute, specialist in education from FAUP, and a master in architectural sciences from uh, Campinas. She's a PhD student in the postgraduate program at the Fluminense Federal University, focusing on urban architecture in colonial Brazil. She has further studies in collection risk management and is a consultant in projects and conservation works for historical edifications. She was the technical coordinator in restoration and modernization, the Municipal Theatre of Rio de Janeiro, and she's currently a participant in the coordination for the recovery of the National Museum as the technical responsible for the coordination of projects and works. Flavia Brito is an architect and historian, a professor at FAO at USP, São Paulo University, post PhD from the University of Paris, Panthéon Sorbonne. She was an architect at IFAN, where she developed many technical studies such as the landscape cultural studies of the Ribeira Valley and also the protection of the Iguapé Historical Center. She has written the books Between Aesthetics and Habit, Departments of Popular Housing, Rio de Janeiro, also Block of Memories, Social Housing, Modern Architecture, and Cultural Heritage. And she's also a co author of the book, all translated into English, the titles Domesticity, Gender, and Cultural Material. She is currently director for the Cultural Preservation Center at the University of São Paulo. I now give the floor to Noemia Barradas for her initial considerations, and then Flavia will introduce our speakers. Welcome all. Good morning, good afternoon to you all. I'd like to congratulate our organizers, especially Utu and Monica. Welcome to our 2022 roundtables. They have all been very important, but I think this roundtable today specifically brings up issues which are priorities for all of us. Cities, housing, heritage, especially vis-a-vis housing, which is very dear to all of us as an issue. I will briefly introduce this theme before our speakers make their presentations. Social conflicts, citizenship, and living well is an opportunity to reflect and advance on culture and heritage in current times. In many territories, today we have three continents in this discussion, in this conversation, who communicate through a broad dialogue on this theme, very important, very current, very topic, which deserves our attention. As never before, we need to take part in this discussion after almost 2 years of pandemic. The pandemic made clear that housing is essential for essential rights such as health and life. Thus, the protection of the rights to housing and health has become a priority, which leads us to think about the paradigm of housing as a consumer asset and also as a way to prepare us for public calamities as we saw, and to think of a post-pandemic scenario, because many people will continue to have their rights to dignified housing violated. The impacts of the pandemic will be followed, have been and will be followed, felt especially by the poor in densely populated area in urban centers. Millions of people, immigrants, have had their rights and their lives affected. Billions of people now have no access to drinkable water, drinking water. Measures are necessary to guarantee their life and health preservation. The right to housing, although it's defended in most constitutions in many countries, many citizens have low preponderance in terms of access to public policies, in terms of budget and strategy. There are many efforts for structural change in status. Public policies need to be devised to improve their lives. Brazil has many progressive urban policies and needs to implement them even more in order to promote the constitutional right to decent housing. The movements for the right to housing since 1940 have been struggling to be recognized by the state. The accumulation of all this resulted in two constitutional articles in 1988, Articles 182 and 183, which aim to establish the establishment of public and private cultural heritage in order to establish the right to public property, reflecting that underused property be converted into housing units. In the Statute of Cities approved in 1981, in order to defend the right to housing, these policies were extending, allowing municipalities to establish guidelines and specific programs according to the master plan. Thus, it is necessary to work on this back step of social rights, establishing rights which have hitherto not left paper. Housing is essential for urban decent living, and the COVID-19 pandemic helped us to see the worsening of vulnerabilities and the reality of those who have nowhere to live become even more grave. From March 2020, everyone knew about the health crisis, from the unstoppable circulation of the disease. The need was already seen for social distancing and isolation, as well as hygiene measures and other policies. The Brazilian legislation, under the function of social concept of property, needed to be already established. We saw the need for emergency occupation of empty spaces. We saw many informally occupied areas. All this leads us to the fact that the risks were terrible. But in spite of everything that has happened and has shown that the local policies were inadequate, discussion has been necessary, especially in municipal areas, metropolitan areas, talking about the inefficient use of empty areas. This inheritage, this heritage has jeopardized our existence, we can say. Through the recovery of heritage for educational use, for personal use, she corrects herself. The use of edifications that need new types of use, and also some other issues need to be resolved. Debates, analysis on themes such as management experiences, urban plans, actions, strategies, and collective interventions by civil society on this theme of social housing in urban centers in protected areas, as well as protected buildings. This needs to be discussed and experimented. The problem needs need to be studied individually as too, if possible. Urban housing processes need to be studied too. The financing of housing and the way this has been used as a monopoly game for the highest bidder, this this has to be fought in order to build projects which can contribute to decent housing. Housing, I understand, as a public policy and are an essential component of the occupation for central areas of town, especially in terms of built heritage. Through continuous policies and programs, with the results and habitation processes and conservation processes, contextualizing the issues with contextual issues are all associated. In order to understand the relevance of the urban planning tactics, the forms of articulation and impacts on social issues and urban center functional recovery. I now give the floor to Flavia to talk a bit about this context, which is not a Brazilian context, it's a world context with regard to housing policies and the use of our vast built heritage stocks, which need to be restudied. Thank you, Noemia. Flavia, please, you have the floor.
Pronto. Bom dia, boa tarde a todas e
Good
todos.
morning, good afternoon to you all. Can you hear me? It's a great pleasure to be here once again, collaborating to this project where to which we dedicated many hours of work in the last year in order to form this debate, which is very important, especially with this roundtable welcoming welcoming such diverse and special people on this theme. I will now introduce all the speakers at once, and then we will invite one by one as they take place. I'd like to thank Monica and Ruben, Noemia also for their partnership, and welcome you all. Mike Turner is an architect, a co-chair in UNESCO Chair for Conservation from the Jerusalem Academy she mentioned. He works on social inclusion, urban sustainability, heritage and design. He is a special envoy from to UNESCO and UNISDR. He is one of the founders of the Our World Heritage Initiative and Heliopolis. He's going to talk about heritage dissonance. Patricia Nurmahomed is a PhD student in architectural culture at the Technical University of Madrid and a professor at Vuittiv University. Master and architect in edified construction. She worked in the Habité Investigation Center at the Candiota University, Université Livre, and she's currently in the Atwalk project. Her field of research is 20th century architecture, focusing on modern architecture in the last half of the 20th century architecture in Mozambique. I apologize for pronouncing your name wrong, Patricia, okay? Rui Leon, he works in editorial work for urbanism and culture. Paupe Porto graduate and a PhD in architecture and urban planning from the institute mentioned. He co-authored with architect Carlota Bruno a project, and he now works on many projects for the Macau government where he works and also on private building projects. He's from the International Council of Portuguese Speaking Architects. He is the president of this entity. He is the president. He is also a visiting professor at the University of the City of Macau. He's going to talk about the intervention and heritage as an activism project. Humberto Monomo is an architect. He is also graduated from Chile. He works on heritage, urban social heritage. He exhibited at Chile, Sao Paulo, Benzin, Veneza. Sorry, her sound is not that good. Many of his works include Reflections for Secondary Teaching, 2017. He is an active member. He is involved in many studies and consultancy works for Chilean public entities. He's currently an associate professor at Architecture School of the University of Chile and part of the Our World Heritage Foundation. He's going to talk about housing and communities when ideas are heritage. Finally, Vanessa Belo, architect, urban planner, master in regional planning from the University of Sao Paulo. She's a professor at PUC Campinas, researcher and collaborator from the Unicamp Geography Institute. She is part of the administrative council in the association. She has been on many committees. She is also part of the management council of the Sao Paulo Cultural network. She is on the Heritage and Cultural and Heritage Council of São Paulo State. She is also manager for public policies at Santo André City. She's going to talk about collective property funds, social rent, and preservation of cultural heritage, the experience of the Haja Fund. Thank you very much to each one of you. I now give the floor to Mike Turner for him to perform his presentation. Once again, I thank you all for being here and listening to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria, my colleague from UIA, and also Monica, friend and colleague of many years. And it is a pleasure to be in Rio again, especially after spending time in considering Rio as a cultural landscape for World Heritage. I'll be speaking today about heritage dissonance and managing social conflicts. There's really the elephant in the room, which we're talking about. Walter Benjamin actually noted that civilizations were created from conflict. He said there's no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And in fact, we just see of the past, the Second World War, about how in fact heritage is used as Goering had said, the Baedeker bombings. And we also see what has happened in the Bamiyan Buddhas, exactly how heritage and conflict come together. So we're really the end of the race, actually trying to understand exactly that heritage can build consensus as opposed to conflict. And we're really looking at, therefore, the conflicts which are in Rio, and we can also then look at that in Macau, and also specifically in Mozambique, between the city of Stone and the city of Maputo. In other words, we actually begin to see that the cities has been fragmented into social structures. And one of the things that we're trying to actually show is that there must be some change here. 1972 was a really important year because it was not just simply the World Heritage Convention, which we're celebrating 50 years, but it's also 50 years for the UN Conference on Human Environment, the Stockholm Conference, which actually brought together the concept of environment. And as Monica had said, it's Article 5, to adopt a general policy to give cultural and natural heritage a function in the life of the community and integrate it within comprehensive planning programs. The other thing which we also have to look at is that the Sustainable Development Goals, and again looking at Target 11.4, to strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage, but to make the cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. There's no goal to protect the world's heritage. There's a target, and the goal is to make the cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And obviously, we're going to be looking at in the next 10 minutes, inclusive and safe. The way that we actually consider inclusive and safe within heritage is to then strengthen our understanding of what is identity. In other words, that people feel relating to a place, relating to groups of people. And we actually see that in the project of culture, cities, and identity in Europe, the actual city identity takes a shape at every level. The image of the city as Rio, or the image of the city as Venice, the identity of neighborhoods like the favela, like Copacabana, and then also the identity of individual inhabitants and the relationships around them. So it is a very complex understanding, and the identity of the culture of any neighborhood can depend on much as the facilities it enjoys. In other words, its intangible heritage, and this is really very critical. So neighborhood identity is established at a very early stage of each neighborhood. It actually has a history of its own, of which it develops over centuries, as well as physical characteristics, including the housing style, type, and tenure. But dissonant heritage was developed by Tunbridge and Ashworth in 1995. And they make an important distinction between the past as what has happened, history as a selective attempt to describe this past, and heritage as a contemporary product shaped from history. And I think that this is where we have to begin to understand and see exactly whether the understanding of dissonant heritage is going to help us to make something better. Samuel Johnson actually had wrote in the Idler in 1767, it would add much to human happiness if an art could be taught of forgetting, all of which the remembrance is at once useless and afflictive. If that pain which never can end in pleasure could be driven away, that the mind might perform its functions without encumbrance, and the past may no longer encroach on the present. In other words, heritage is very forward-looking. It is nothing to do, essentially, with the past. And the way which we're going to actually suggest then a way forward is the metropolis. The metropolis of the 21st century is going to be the most important settlement pattern that we're going to know. In other words, the metropolises will represent the human settlement typology with the largest population. UN Habitat says a new metropolis will arise every 2 weeks in the next 15 years to a total of 429 new metropolises. So we're going to see that there will be by 2035, 2,363 metropolises. This is something which we're beginning to understand. A metropolis is not a large city. In the same way as the historic urban landscape said that the city is more than a group of buildings, we are now saying through the same document that the metropolis is not a large city. It is a new animal. And this we can see in the metropolis of Paris. We can see it also in the metropolis of Beijing. And we can see exactly how, in fact, new elements which we can take place and see beyond in Shouyang commercial center, which then have patterns of development of historic cities. The Chicago School actually explained, in fact, that the city had rings, and the richer and the wealthier you were, the further out that you lived from the center of the city. By 1930, they said, no, it's more like a pie chart, that it's actually got little centers around it. And then there became, therefore, the sector theory. And we're now in a situation of looking at the multiple nuclear model. And this is going to be, straight away, I'm coming to the answer, as exactly where we need to be. So the urban area is no longer a simple element around a center, but it is also a polynuclear center, multiple combinations of urban areas with peri-urban agglomerations, and this can allow to solve our problems. We're looking at multiplicities. Deleuze's concept of multiplicity is therefore the most basic sense, a complex structure that does not reference a prior unity. And in this way, we begin to then understand better how the metropolis then accepts the multiplicities and can then help for a better, wouldn't say solving conflict, but understanding conflict. Amartya Sen, in his excellent book, speaks about identity and violence. In one sentence, he said, the more identities you have, the less violence there is. So we can then create these multiple identities. I can see the drawing which I prepared for the heritage in the metropolis is that each individual area then makes up the whole, and then we can have then things which are actually taking place by themselves. So together, metropolis is beyond the city, allowing for the multiplicities to take place between culture and nature. To this to be added the digital revolution. The digital revolution now empowers individuals rather than external hierarchies. And therefore, this creates a new upside down structure, creating of civil society, being able to be more a part of it. And then Niamona spoke about, Nomia spoke about the open spaces. And we're talking about project and process. The city is no longer made up of projects, but processes. So what do we have? Meanwhile places, meanwhile activities which take place. And we had the opportunity of listening to Enrique Avocado from Buenos Aires speaking about independent culture, which in fact comes up bottom up into the city. Heritage is the space where we ask ourselves who we are, who we were, and who we want to be. And in fact, at the end of this, therefore, to solve or to actually manage the issue of social conflict in a world that is increasingly subject to the forces of globalization, in a world which the search for cultural identity is pursued through aggressive nationalism and the suppression of cultures of minorities, the essential contribution made by the consideration of authentication of the values and narratives in conservation practice is to clarify and illuminate the collective memory of humanity. That is our challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. This was great and just on time. So eu tenho que falar em português. Desculpa.
Oh, I'm supposed to speak in Portuguese. So thank you, Mike. It was a pleasure to hear you. And thank you for complying with the time as well. I now pass the floor to Patricia so she will present, and please stick to 15 minutes and I'll let you know when you have 20 minutes to, okay? Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. From Maputo, good morning. Before anything, I'd like to thank Monica for having me to join this dialogue table. And Flavia for the introduction. It is a pleasure to be here and share this research that I've been conducting over the last few years. The topic I'll be presenting has to do with my PhD and also with my investigation procedure that has to do with the Portuguese literature. I'm going to reflect on my need to redefine modern housing places in Mozambique during the last Portuguese colonization cycle. On the last instances, can favor the development of an integrated debate between heritage, citizenship, and well-being in favor of issues as the right for a decent housing in a city. So this rises from a question: how to promote social recognition of the modern architecture of Mozambique, and particularly what has to do with housing or the architecture, modern architecture of the country. How can we match the heritage valuing of this legacy with its recent conflictual extraordinary condition? So I'll now make a brief introduction of the context for Mozambique's modern architecture. This is a direct consequence of the affirmation of Portuguese imperialism under the new state after the end of the Second World War. This is particularly interesting because it is known as a period of decolonization of the African continent, and the Portuguese colonial government has explored, and Africa's map was rapidly changing. Mozambique saw its own expansion of cities through new buildings and modern buildings. With the colonial building, as we call it, the Portuguese colonial Africa, they started late in 1964 in Mozambique, and the beginning of the National Liberation Front has sped up This process given a series of measures promoted by the new state to reinforce their presence and influence on colonized territories. These measures have overcome the civil construction area, especially on housing. And then there was a momentary boom in Mozambique, especially in 1963. This development is now the backbone of the main cities in the country, and that is where the contemporary urban life in Mozambique developed itself. After 1963, the necessities provided by the armed fight and the deeds that took to the independence of Mozambique in 1965 and 1975, the building boom was complete. So this, according to the current literature, academic literature about the topic, and this is a conception of the modern architecture in Mozambique as a closer chapter of the 20th century architecture chapter. So this ignores the process of independence and the change of political regime and the century of post-colonial century of life as if it hadn't produced any effect. Such approach offers a very limited view of the issue because the past, as said, can never be understood solely within its own terms. The present continually rewrites the meaning of the past and the memories and histories we construct about it. In other words, in spite of the important work of the documentation, the several investigations on Mozambique's architectural modernity since the past times, they were unable to have an impact on its valuing through the heritage policies in the country or its social acknowledgement, and the heritage should be preserved and conserved. That's why I consider to be necessary a methodological redistribution in studying Mozambique's modern architecture and a discussion as heritage, as cultural heritage. This has to be, since its design of ever changing heritage, and then framing it in its contemporaneities in terms of an open narrative and continued construction. In this way, we Mozambique's independence is not the end of the modern architecture protection, but as the beginning of the construction of its own heritage construction. This is the consideration of the heritage being a social construction. And then there's multiple processes, dynamic processes of broadening, of widening, not only its physical aspects or material aspects, but on a less analysis on the meanings that people construct around it on their day-to-day lives. In the case of Mozambique, these meanings are even more interesting to understand, given the transition process from colonialism to independence brought a complex process of appropriation of colonial buildings. The massive exit of the European origin people in the regime change left a higher number of houses abandoned within the urban cities of the main cities in the country. These houses were literally nationalized by the state and occupied by part of the local population that were restricted but to peripheries and brought their own habits and customs. Throughout time of the different changes in the political socio-economic context in the country, of the country, locals in the city changed their habits, and this was over the legacy of modern living, and then they had new uses and meanings. Therefore, this consideration confirmed my suggestion that for you to talk about modern housing in Mozambique as heritage and its potential, there are parts related not only to architecture project developed in the colonial times, but the several process of appropriation and reappropriation, both spontaneous and forced, that happened throughout time, and the different narratives that habitants and users were building simultaneously around this legacy. This overlaying of the three conditions is what I've been doing with some buildings in the cities, and results have been pretty interesting and even surprising because they reveal the current narrative to the discourse of authority by the current academic reading. This is the number of buildings that we see here, and this is a reference to the current landscape of the capital of Mozambique. This project was promoted in 1970 by the National Intermarine Bank, trying to show the colonial fight and the apparent economic stability and the trust in the Portuguese stay in Mozambique, Portuguese permanence in Mozambique. They bought two towers for housing. They're fragmented in four bodies from different authors. However, what motivated the independence of Mozambique, they left the uh, beauty unfinished. The situation has been kept for many years, and then the construction was completed in the beginning or in early 1990s. For its conclusion in 1982 and 1990, they had an extensive project of changing and transformation for the premises of the original project. After that, one of the towers is still managed by the state, and the other was handed in to the Mozambique Bank. And then after that moment, one of the towers is in better state of conservation than the other. In addition, the regional project suggested four apartment models that were a mutation of the main project. This project followed the tripartite construction project. And there were two different accesses, one for domestic workers and the other one for the family. In this setting, each tower would include 81 apartments, totalizing 162 the whole building. But this wasn't materialized after interruption of the building and with a new ideology. The project decided to change the construction that was defined in the original project, and it housed a higher number of apartments than previously planned. Then the original setting was radically changed. Instead of 81 apartments, each tower had 164 apartments. Most of those was built from the reconfiguration of the original apartment and two smaller apartments. And with this setting, the prior division in service zones has disappeared in the strict sense that it existed before. So the building that was built for the highest levels of the social classes ended up becoming turning into apartments for poorer people. Though the story doesn't end here, it is nowadays it is much more mixed, and the number of apartments is successfully adapted every for a different lifestyle. Through the mapping made in 2019, we could see several transformation strategies, including um, knocking walls down, changing materials, and other transformations. This indicates a high latitude of the project and the desire of the inhabitants to adapt to architecture that wasn't initially thought for them. This desire to change and adapt spaces also shows that inhabitants have to rewrite their own narratives. And that's part of the corrective memory. It is interesting to see one, and it has to do with the statue of the towers as a Hubert milestone, and they are attractive because of the easy access to equipment. Because of that, although the huge problems of conservation that one of the tower has, few residents consider it to be the possibility of abandoning the building on a mid and long term. But so for some of them, this is the only option to be in the city center because of the um, real estate speculation. Some interviewed people said that the current trend in terms of housing in Maputo is to go to the periphery. But while most of the basic services is here, we are not living, even though we have to continue to live in a small place. And this has to do with the heritage or the debate on heritage, modern heritage. This is together with the right to city, the right as the right to an urban life, a changed one, renewed one, right to centrality, to places in time that allows for the full use of those moments and places, associating that debate of right to the city with with Mozambique's modern heritage, in my opinion, can take to the social recognition and valuing, heritage valuing of this debate. In this sense, the participation of citizenship is paramount to activate heritage and results necessary that there should be investigation on this topic and redefinition on how to approach the study of this legacy. Redefinition, as I suggest, goes through a diachronic reading where they are incorporated to the narratives of the inhabitants as an alternative to the authorized discourse. This is the last instance of decolonizing the disciplinary knowledge and investigation about what modern patrimony of Mozambique is. So I'm done presenting with this quote of one of the families that bases this argumentation. This is my house. Of course, I love it. Thank you. Hope I contributed to this debate. Thank you very much, Patricia, for your presentation. It was so clear, well organized, and led us to Mozambique. Thank you, and I'll pass the floor to Rui Leão for his presentation. Good evening, everyone. Can I share my screen?
Ainda não, Rui.
We can see your screen yet?
Agora sim, está iniciando.
Yes, it is okay now.
Precisa colocar em tela cheia. Por favor.
Tá?
Tá melhor, mas ainda não está em tela cheia. A gente
It is
acaba
better, but isn't full screen yet.
exibir normalmente tela cheia, né?
Só segundo.
One moment, please. I apologize. I think this is going to work.
Tá bom.
Can you see it?
Tá bom.
Ainda está um pouco pequeno, viu, Rui? Acho que você teria.
Com o meu PowerPoint, mas tudo bem.
Não tem problema, vamos seguir, vamos tocar.
Eu vou falar sobre este tema do projeto como
um meio de advocacia e de ativismo a partir de um projeto que nós desenvolvemos e que foi uma intervenção nesta escola, que é um edifício fabuloso, que fica no centro da cidade, que é desenhado pelo arquiteto João Ramalho e construído entre 63 e 69, no centro da cidade. E que tem esta configuração bauhausiana de arquitetura de pavilhões e que, para mim, é um edifício que está em risco de demolição, já teve classificado nos anos até 95, depois foi desclassificado e passou a estar em risco de demolição por ser um terreno mesmo no centro e muito cobiçado pelo desenvolvimento urbano. E Macau tem este grande desafio que tem relativamente poucas políticas de proteção de património e uma pressão imobiliária enorme, devido à economia muito associada aos casinos. E, portanto, eu, a partir de 2004, passei a ter uma relação muito intensa e feroz com este edifício, porque era o edifício, digamos, de maior escala e maior qualidade modernista em Macau, e eu estava bastante convencido que era uma peça-chave sem a qual seria difícil de perceber o período moderno em Macau. Portanto, ele particularmente é para mim interessante também por uma questão ideológica, porque é um dos primeiros edifícios modernistas construídos em território chinês por um discípulo do Corbusier, trazendo estes princípios todos da primeira e da segunda geração de arquitetos modernistas, e que tinham também, de alguma maneira, montado o seu revisionismo plástico e filosófico a partir de um olhar ao Oriente, muito à arquitetura japonesa, à Índia, as viagens do Hermann Hesse, do Bruno Taut, do Corbusier, de Pierre Gendry, à procura de uma página em branco. Eu achava que isto era uma coincidência interessante, este edifício estar em território chinês. Ele fica no centro da cidade, neste aterro verde, são tudo aterros recentes. Este é um aterro de 1940 e tem esta planta bastante interessante, porque cria uma relação muito complexa com as ruas e aproximações e afastamentos. Aqui o ponto o cerne da questão era esta linha do tempo que eu fiz, que representa a minha relação com o edifício, e eu queria aqui a cor-de-rosa indicar o período em que o edifício esteve mais ou menos em risco de ser vendido e demolido. Depois a intervenção, as várias conferências, publicações que eu fui fazendo a partir de 2004 em defesa do património. A própria criação do Docomomo Macau tem origem na defesa deste edifício. O projeto que nós fizemos, que está marcado a azul escuro, em 2007, que aparece como uma encomenda da escola, e esta encomenda é interessante porque, de alguma maneira, é a partir deste projeto, uma intervenção num dos pátios, que ela própria permite um novo olhar sobre o edifício, e que, portanto, acaba por reforçar muito a ideia de que o edifício tem este sentido de ser algo para que se olha, portanto, esta nossa intervenção depois premiada com o Prémio de Inovação da Unesco em 2012, veio também por causa da premiação a conseguir segurar em grande parte o edifício e alterar um pouco as políticas que havia sobre ele. Umas imagens do edifício da escola, aqui ao centro o pavilhão do ginásio, e este desenho de arquitetura bastante, bastante preocupado com questões também contextuais da região, que é esta ideia do desenho de encaixe, que é muito central na arquitetura chinesa, e da ideia de transmitir a ideia da construção em madeira e da construção em bambu, apesar de ser um edifício todo em betão à vista. Aqui uns pormenores da entrada e a sensibilização. Isto foi é um momento, são alguns momentos importantes que passaram por uma petição de arquitetos portugueses que eu entreguei quando o primeiro-ministro de Portugal esteve na escola, e que conseguiu atrasar esta venda, que depois nunca se realizou, e a demolição em 2006, e depois dois pedidos de classificação que através da Docomomo fizemos ao Instituto Cultural para reter o edifício. E aqui um momento que foi de facto muito importante na preservação do edifício, que foi a atribuição de uma classificação, de um prémio que era da própria Unesco e que acabou por criar uma grande pressão no governo para não permitir que o edifício todo onde esta placa acabou por ficar estava. Aqui um pormenor, que é esta coisa de eu ter vários chapéus e de ir trocando os chapéus, no caso desta intervenção e desta ação à volta da escola portuguesa. De facto, foi muito através de usar vários canais que eu julgo que tivemos algum sucesso em o edifício ainda lá estar, e queria passar a falar um pouco só, não do projeto em si, mas das ações, de como o projeto se faz uso e procura ser oportunista em relação a este olhar sobre o edifício. Tem aqui uma planta embaixo, lado esquerdo embaixo, que é o pátiozinho, que é um pátio com 10 por 10, e esta primeira ideia que se vê no corte, que é nós temos apercebido que o edifício, o resto do chão todo o edifício tem esta faixa de janelas de ventilação em cima e esta faixa de portas em baixo, e uma faixa e uma peça metálica que as separa. E foi muito a partir daí que nós construímos, de olhar para o edifício e para a fenestração, que nós construímos o projeto, porque foi exatamente naquela faixa preta que nós fomos instalar a laje da nova sala de leitura, como se pode ver aqui. Ao fundo ainda é o edifício existente, onde estão aquelas cadeiras, e aqui é a transição para a sala de leitura. E, portanto, criámos um pé direito muito baixo, mínimo, e, portanto, esta ideia de enterrar a sala de leitura foi importante para conseguir criar uma certa escala de estar quando se está dentro do espaço. Isto é uma vista da sala de leitura lá do fundo. E houve esta outra estratégia de não encostar a sala ao edifício. Portanto, as fachadas do pátio, com um afastamento mínimo de pouco mais de 1 metro, acabaram por funcionar como uma espécie de saguões onde entra a luz e onde se está constantemente a olhar para as fachadas do edifício modernista do Chorão Ramalho. E aqui outro corte, portanto, transversal à sala de leitura, onde se percebe que como é que a luz entra através destes, que não chegam a ser pátios, são só umas faixas onde passa a luz, mas foi nesta faixa que criámos uns jardins lineares que acabam por criar uma sobreposição com as fachadas do edifício modernista, que torna toda esta experiência do espaço numa experiência visual. E uma coisa que eu acho que acaba por ser muito interessante, um pouco como consequência do espaço limitado, é haver tanta intenção e essa intenção está tão densamente apertada no espaço. Há aqui outra questão que tem a ver com esta árvore que lá estava, esta palmeira que estava no centro, que nós quisemos manter, portanto construímos um pequeno vazio só para deixar sair esta palmeira, e isto novamente cria uma complexidade de luz que acaba por ser um pátio em que esta árvore acaba por ser muito presente na vivência do espaço. Aqui estas faixas, estes golpes de luz a vários níveis, e este enchimento com paisagismo, com plantas ao longo do perímetro, cria esta fachada, esta ilusão de contexto exterior, que acaba por ser praticamente quase inexistente, não é? E portanto, através destas intenções e nesta imagem percebe-se a relação com o edifício que está à volta. Portanto, quando se passa do átrio de entrada principal da escola para esta sala de leitura, há também esta possibilidade de olhar para cima e ver as fachadas que saem, porque o bloco da escola tem 3 pisos e, portanto, continua mais para cima, e acaba por ser um espaço de contemplação sobre o edifício pré-existente, e oferecer um ato de contemplação sobre o seu contexto imediato. A intervenção acabou por ser muito bem recebida, porque queria...
Oi, com licença, já deu 15 minutos, tá? Para te avisar. Deu 15 minutos.
Okay. Eu termino já, porque eu queria apresentar, praticamente era isto, mas concluindo...
Para te avisar, obrigada, viu?
Ok, concluindo, não só a questão do projeto ter sido reconhecido, mas eu julgo que mais importante é esta ideia de se ter conseguido construir um espaço interior onde o jardim continua lá, que é uma sobreposição que o projeto consegue realizar. Acaba por fazer dele um espaço muito especial, acaba por ser um espaço onde a escola recebe todo o tipo de visitas exteriores, não na direção, mas nesta salinha de leitura, e isso acabou por conseguir agarrar o edifício estes 18 anos em que ainda não conseguimos que fosse classificado. E era isto que vos queria partilhar com vocês. Muito obrigado.
Muito, muito obrigada, Rui, pela sua apresentação, a sua experiência. Eu queria, então, sem mais, passar a palavra para o Humberto Bonomo, para ele fazer a sua apresentação. Queria aproveitar para dizer a todos e todas que as perguntas já podem ser feitas no chat, que a gente vai organizando aqui para o final do debate. Então, quem tiver já questões, pode ir organizando as perguntas por meio do chat, que nós vamos organizando, tá certo? Muito obrigada, Humberto, com você.
Muchas gracias, muchas gracias Flavia por el espacio y por supuesto que Mónica y Rubens por la oportunidad por invitarme a presentar este trabajo, y aprovecho también de saludar a Mike, Lucía y a todas las personas con las cuales hemos trabajado en estos años en Our World Heritage. La presentación de hoy tiene que ver con vivienda y comunidades, entendiendo cómo las ideas que están detrás de los proyectos de vivienda, específicamente los proyectos de vivienda moderna que le voy a presentar hoy, son entendidas patrimonio, y cuál es el rol de las comunidades en la definición de ese patrimonio, el rol de la sociedad civil, el rol de los habitantes, el rol también de la academia en todo este proceso. Voy a presentar específicamente 3 casos. Me aprovecho de la introducción y la presentación de las introducciones que se han hecho y la presentación de Mike para no repetir algunas cosas, por lo tanto iré directamente a los casos de estudio. La primera idea que me gustaría plantear es que desde un tiempo hasta la actualidad, pero sobre todo en los temas vinculados a vivienda, entendemos claramente cómo el patrimonio es un derecho. En los años 30, en los años 50, se ha propuesto, y de hecho también los derechos de la humanidad, universales de la humanidad, plantean la vivienda como un derecho, y sabemos cuáles son las políticas de vivienda digamos, del siglo XX, que plantearon cómo tradicionalmente la vivienda es un derecho. Y a esto se suma que el patrimonio es un derecho cuando cuando se asocia la idea de patrimonio a estos conjuntos habitacionales, a estos entornos que hoy día son considerados patrimonio por sus ideas, por sus características arquitectónicas, urbanas, sociales, que los han justificado, que los han creado y que los han promovido en la primera mitad del siglo XX. Yo estoy hablando en este caso de Chile. El primer caso que le voy a mostrar es la Villa Presidente Frei, una urbanización que hoy día se ubica en una zona bastante céntrica en Santiago. Está vinculada a importante arteria de comunicación y también estaciones de metro, que es un conjunto que se construyó, una gran unidad vecinal para más de 25.000 personas, que se construyó una antigua chacra, una antigua finca periurbana, un antiguo lugar de cultivo que desde el principio, desde los primeros años, digamos, mantuvo el parque, y en el sector 1, el que ven aquí a la izquierda, un parque muy importante con una presencia, por lo tanto, de la arborización. Los árboles que se ven ahí en la parte izquierda de la imagen fueron un elemento fundamental de la identidad del barrio. El valor urbano, pero también agrícola, de la antigua chacra de Valparaíso se traslada al interior del proyecto, al interior de la urbanización, fomentando con eso la dimensión peatonal propia de las ideas de las unidades vecinales de los años 30, pero en el fondo aquí con particular sentido porque se crea este parque como eje articulador peatonal de la identidad del barrio. Vemos, por lo tanto, que a unos edificios, torres y bloques de vivienda dialogan desde su fundación, desde su creación, con jardines, con áreas verdes y con árboles, que son árboles existentes, que tienen, en este caso, muchos años y que todavía viven en el corazón del conjunto. Para fomentar la idea peatonal del conjunto, se hunden las calles para dar con eso la preferencia al peatón y a la vida del peatón en el conjunto, y construir una gran isla peatonal de casi 1 kilómetro de largo. Aquí ven una imagen de lo que les decía de este sector que hoy día es un sector que es declarado zona típica, porque desde el minuto, en el fondo, cuando en este este diario de la época se celebra la construcción de este conjunto habitacional, de esta gran unidad vecinal, que servía para más de 25.000 personas en el centro de Santiago. Hoy la Villa Frey es una zona típica, es una figura de protección oficial del Ministerio del Consejo de Monumentos Nacionales, que es el organismo público que declara y protege el patrimonio en la categoría de zona. Y es zona típica la Villa Frey porque ha habido un importante trabajo de puesta en valor y de visibilización del patrimonio que aquí está presente. Por supuesto que son ideas modernas que transitaron en todo el mundo occidental en esos años. Digamos, no hablaría como normalmente se hace de una implantación, de un traslado. Eran las ideas que se estaban debatiendo de manera bastante general en todo el mundo occidental, y que en este caso se configuran con particular potencia, con particular protagonismo, y esos valores, esas ideas han sido bien entendidas, han sido aprovechadas y por parte de los habitantes, a tal punto que ellos mismos se organizaron en conjunto también con organizaciones como Docomomo, que participó del proceso, y algunas academias, algunas universidades que fomentaron ese proceso, pero hubo una serie de iniciativas que pusieron en valor, volvieron a flote esas ideas y esos valores arquitectónicos, urbanos, constructivos, sociales, a tal punto que ese conjunto habitacional hoy es declarado como en la categoría de zona típica. La segunda unidad vecinal es la unidad vecinal Exegiel González Cortés, conocida como Villa Olímpica, que está muy cerca a la anterior que les mostré, también una zona bastante central de Santiago, porque la ubicación de estos conjuntos, estos nuevos barrios de vivienda céntricos en la ciudad, era parte de la ideología de las unidades públicas que financiaron estas grandes urbanizaciones, porque tenían que estar bien ubicadas en la ciudad y por lo tanto ofrecer oportunidades de vida urbana, de calidad, de conectividad a sus habitantes. Y en ese momento en Chile el Estado tenía plena conciencia de eso. La Villa Olímpica se construyó en ocasión de los mundiales del 62 que se jugaron en Chile, y fue en principio el lugar donde se alojaron las delegaciones deportivas que vinieron de todo el mundo, y después esos departamentos fueron vendidos y asignados a familias que pertenecían a la caja de empleados particulares, que eran como los institutos de previsión de la época. Las ideas, por lo tanto, en este caso, en el caso de la Villa Olímpica, se hizo un concurso, se presentaron muchas propuestas, y las ideas y la calidad arquitectónica y constructiva era tal que se incluyó en el conjunto también una torre que fue por varios años una torre muy importante y una de las más altas de Santiago. La densidad de este conjunto, por supuesto, el terreno a disposición era menor que el anterior, y por lo tanto los arquitectos buscan articular distintas tipologías, desde bloques que se disponen para construir plazas comunitarias en las cuales en el fondo los niños y los jóvenes podían jugar y desempeñar una vida de calidad, hasta casas de 1 y 2 pisos, generando con eso entornos urbanos con identidad, con diversidad, y acogiendo también la diversidad de la vida de las familias que ahí se daban. La Villa Olímpica hoy día también es una zona típica, también está declarada, también sus características arquitectónicas y urbanas han sido valoradas por sus habitantes, y no solamente valorada, sino reconocida y puesta en el fondo sobre la discusión en un momento en que la Villa Frey, la Villa Olímpica, estaba sujeta a procesos de transformación urbana en los sectores aledaños, la aparición de las torres, hicieron, en el fondo, levantaron los movimientos sociales, las comunidades habitantes de la Villa Olímpica para que este barrio permaneciera, digamos, genuinamente conservado en relación a la aparición de estas torres, como se ve en la fotografía de la derecha, que amenazaban con cambiar la estructura, la densidad, la ocupación del suelo y también afectar en las áreas verdes comunitarias, que son el elemento fundamental de este tejido conectivo sobre el cual se distribuyen los edificios. Como les decía, las marchas que se generaron para frenar la aparición de las torres, como se ve ahí en el fondo de la imagen de la derecha, estas torres de especulación inmobiliaria de nivel socioeconómico medio, pero que en el fondo amenazaban la tranquilidad y la dimensión y la escala urbana del conjunto. En la Villa Olímpica, como les decía, también ha sido declarada zona típica y hay un juego, por ejemplo, que es Villápolis, que releva la historia, releva las comunidades, releva la identidad del barrio, releva los sectores específicos que forman parte de la identidad de este conjunto. Nuevamente estamos al frente de una relación dialéctica entre las ideas arquitectónicas y modernas que fueron durante décadas criticadas y puestas en duda por la historiografía del urbanismo, digamos, de los años 80, nos damos cuenta cómo la calidad arquitectónica y urbana de estos conjuntos en realidad en época de COVID, por ejemplo, ha ofrecido unas dimensiones urbanas y de generosidad muy, muy grata para los habitantes. El último conjunto es el conjunto que yo personalmente más conozco, fue el tema de mi tesis de doctorado, es la unidad vecinal Portales, otro conjunto que también está ubicado, como ven, céntricamente en la mancha urbana del Santiago actual. En 1950 era relativamente periférico, pero muy bien conectado y cercano, si bien periférico, cercano al centro consolidado de la ciudad. Esta obra fue obra de Brechani Valdés Castillo Huidobro, una importante oficina de arquitectura del momento, y nuevamente la articulación entre bloques y casas en áreas verdes comunitarias. Hay que pensar aquí que los arquitectos edificaron y construyeron solamente el 20% del terreno que tenían a disposición, porque el 80% tenía que estar a disposición del desarrollo de la vida comunitaria de los nuevos habitantes que eran funcionarios y empleados particulares de esta caja de previsión. En la villa, la especificidad de la Villa Portales es que tiene un sistema de calles elevadas en el tercer piso de los edificios, con la posibilidad de acceder a través de rampas helicoidales como la que ven a la izquierda, vehículos, automóviles, ambulancias, en el fondo para justificar con eso la creación de un edificio de 7 pisos cuando la norma permitía máximo 4 pisos. La calidad constructiva, insisto con este tema, la calidad constructiva, los materiales, la generosidad de los tipos y de la cantidad de metros cuadrados por habitante, muy superior, casi el doble de lo que se construye hoy día en Santiago. Fíjense los jardines que estaban plantados y mantenidos por parte de la institución en el 1960, en la época de estas fotografías. Aquí vemos la relación entre el conjunto que todavía estaba en construcción, algunos de los bloques, la cordillera de los Andes, los árboles, nuevamente, los árboles existentes que se mantuvieron como parte del valor patrimonial de este antiguo parque que se interviene para construir este conjunto y que son parte de la identidad del conjunto. Aquí vemos la transparencia entre el espacio privado y el espacio común y cómo la vida moderna se desarrollaba en la Villa Portales. Se incluyeron también obras de un artista plástico, Ricardo Irarrázaval. Aquí ven imágenes de estas pasarelas elevadas, 1950, los techos, jardines de las casas. Sí, estoy terminando, Flavia. Estoy terminando. Y los techos jardines que formaron parte, como decía, de la identidad, a tal punto que en 1968 se creó este periódico de la villa que recoge las historias de los vecinos de la Villa Portales. Un barrio, por lo tanto, lleno de historia y de identidad que, como les decía, ha sido objeto de procesos de restauración y recuperación por parte del Estado, porque claramente los valores, la riqueza y las dimensiones modernas tenían que ser recuperadas y puesta en valor para los próximos 50 años. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Muito obrigada, Humberto, por essa apresentação que nos levou ao Chile. E eu passo, então, a palavra à Vanessa Belo para fazer sua exposição. Vanessa, a palavra está com você.
Obrigada, Flávia. Bom dia a todos e todas. Queria aqui, em nome da Mônica, agradecer o convite e parabenizar todos os organizadores e organizadoras dessa mesa, que eu acho que ela é muito fundamental, né? Eu pedi para passar um vídeo antes de começar a minha apresentação. Então, não sei quem que vai passar.
Vanessa,
Então,
já vou colocar, tá bom?
Tá, legal. E aí eu vou pedir só para você cortar o vídeo na hora que ele começar os créditos, tá? Porque aí tem mais um tanto de crédito que não precisa ser passado. E aí, na sequência, eu já entro com a minha compartilhamento de tela. Então, se você puder introduzir aí um pouco o tema para a gente começar.
Somos um grupo de pessoas solidárias, preocupadas com o direito à cidade, o direito à moradia digna, os direitos humanos, a sustentabilidade, a preservação do patrimônio cultural, a transformação social, a democracia, a ética e a transparência.
Juntos criamos o Fundo Haja, uma associação sem fins lucrativos que busca adquirir imóveis vazios, especialmente aqueles de interesse histórico e cultural em áreas centrais, para restaurá-los e disponibilizá-los para locação social, promovendo a moradia digna a preços acessíveis para a população de baixa renda.
Somos muito diversos e trabalhamos de forma integrada. Somos arquitetos, urbanistas, estudantes, historiadores, docentes, advogados, sociólogos, engenheiros, empresários, jornalistas, economistas, biólogos, geógrafos, psicólogos, médicos, veterinários.
Reunimos alguns investidores sociais e já compramos o primeiro imóvel, uma casinha linda de 1925 que estava vazia no centro de Campinas. Essa casa abrigará com dignidade famílias vulneráveis chefiadas por mulheres com filhos.
A sustentabilidade ambiental também é importante. A casa vai contar com infraestruturas verdes, como áreas permeáveis para melhorar a drenagem, reaproveitamento de água da chuva, compostagem e reciclagem de resíduos e energia solar.
Gostou da ideia? Quer ajudar? Você pode doar para ajudar na reforma da casa e ajudar a recuperar o nosso patrimônio cultural. Você pode contribuir para melhorar o nosso centro e, ao mesmo tempo, a vida de muitas pessoas de baixa renda que precisam de moradia.
Você pode participar dos nossos eventos culturais beneficentes todo mês. Você pode seguir a gente nas redes sociais e divulgar para os amigos essa iniciativa. Ajude essa ideia a se tornar realidade. Precisamos da sua colaboração para que tudo isso aconteça. Faça parte disso você também.
Haja.
Reaja.
Agora.
Juntos.
Com amor.
Para que haja
Oportunidade.
Solidariedade.
Para que haja
moradia digna.
Para que haja
inclusão social.
Para que haja
um centro melhor.
Preservação cultural.
Para que haja
direito à cidade.
Venha para o haja.
Doe.
haja
Com amor.
Acho que agora podemos desligar o vídeo. Bom, pessoal, eu vou compartilhar a tela aqui com vocês para complementar aí essa apresentação. Vocês só me falem se vocês estão vendo.
Sim, estamos vendo sim, Vanessa. Pode dar prosseguimento. Obrigada.
Bom, então, vou falar um pouquinho dessa experiência que nós estamos desenvolvendo aqui, que é uma associação sem fins lucrativos, montada pela sociedade civil, para a gente promover a habitação social no centro de Campinas, uma das maiores cidades do Brasil, que tem 1.200.000 habitantes, a terceira maior cidade do estado de São Paulo e a 14ª do Brasil. Alguns dados aqui, né, do nosso déficit habitacional no Brasil. Então, a gente tem aí um perfil de 42% que ganham até um salário mínimo e 33% de até 2 salários mínimos de renda familiar. E também nós temos um perfil dentro do déficit habitacional de maioria de mulheres chefes de família, né? Então, isso também é uma preocupação nossa para definir o perfil dessa população que a gente pretende colocar nesse primeiro imóvel que a gente já adquiriu. No Sudeste, a gente tem ainda algumas particularidades, né, na região Sudeste do Brasil, onde o ônus excessivo com aluguel é a maior demanda dentro da composição do déficit habitacional. E no Brasil, a gente praticamente não tem políticas que envolvam patrimônio cultural e habitação, reabilitação de áreas centrais com uma política massiva de patrimônio, de recuperação do patrimônio e também de habitação social e alocação social. Aqui para falar um pouquinho de Campinas, então, nós temos a cidade de Campinas, né? Não sei se vocês estão vendo aqui, né? O estado de São Paulo, aonde fica, vocês que são de fora do Brasil. Então, aqui é a cidade de Campinas, aqui está a nossa área central, e todos esses vermelhinhos aqui são as populações. Dando um zoom na área central, a gente vê então que a gente tem uma área central de bastante alta renda, e no centro ainda uma renda média alta, predominando com algumas quadras.
Too high in some blocks. There are some concentrations, and low-income people will prevail. So we have 70,000 units as housing deficit in Brazil. We have 42,000 people registered in the municipality interested in housing. So it is a pretty high number, and most of that profile is women that had families, and within that profile, they build nearly 30,000 demands for housing. And here we surveyed the citizen of Campinas regarding the situation and information. And so here is what I share with you now on the cultural interest properties in the city center of Campinas. We surveyed this in 2021. 1416 properties of cultural interest, 141 are listed, 45 are being studied, and 229 of cultural interest classified by us. This was made in partnership with the Commons Brazil and Campinas book, the PUC, which is a university where I teach. And we also researched in this city center perimeter, and we discovered that the city center has 813 empty properties. 315 of them are parking lots, 117 are properties that are not being used, and 17 are urban empty spaces, not to mention apartments that are empty. We're not able to account for. This is a universe of nearly 3,000 properties surveyed, so it's pretty high. This reflects Campinas is one of the largest cities in Brazil. This reflects the situation of our urban centers in big cities in Brazil. When you cross heritage and sociology, we found 70 cultural interest properties that have some degree of sociology. They're either empty or they're not fully used. We also searched the property value because we're working with rent, and we're also going to purchase properties. So we have to understand this universe. So we started the city center. In some parts of them, the sale price is pretty different. This is near the city hall. This is more qualified, a wealthier neighborhood, so the price is a little higher. And when it comes to rent, we realized the opposite. The average of rent price for square meter, and we selected some properties to make a financial modeling before buying the first property. These are some properties we modeled, and that's the one we ended up buying. We made a sheet for each property, nearly 200 sheets of that type. We understood what the properties were, the square meter, and the value. So we're also monitoring the market in the city of Campinas. So here's an example, just so you know. And the house we ended up buying late last year, we discovered during our historical search that the house was built in 1929, not 1925, as you saw in the video. The video you watched is a release video of the project. It was released in March of this year. So it is a new project that we are studying in Campinas, but it was also incubated and inspired by experience that is going on in Sao Paulo through the FICA fund that today has they bought 4 properties for social housing.
Aqui, só para vocês verem a localização, então a gente tem aqui um grande imóvel tombado, que é o...
This is the location. We have a property that is listed, a technical school, and we are right here at the BS Rapid Transit that has been recently inaugurated. The house faces that, and when we bought that property, when we talk about Battle housing, Battle heritage was built in the 30s, 40s. It was built for social housing. We nearly blocked the verticalization of this block. We see this happening in the city center. They buy many houses. They are still unrecognized heritage, and then they will end up building there. This is the process of our association, and we were based on the principles: solidarity, transparency, right to the city, human rights, sustainability, and democracy. And a while back, at least in Brazil, well, the principles were pretty clear for us. We don't have to claim and reaffirm that. But there's so much attack to human rights in Brazil and attack to democracy. We need to reaffirm these principles all the time. So we have our objectives to promote collective property that is non-speculative, promote social rent for low-income people, promote preservation of cultural heritage, actions targeting human rights, green infrastructures, and this is to talk about our work process. So through a workshop, several architects and employees in our association, we had several designs, preliminary studies. We reached a proposal that would respect the heritage, but would better leverage that property. And then we developed the executive project with the cooperation of the voluntary work of one of our associates, Maria Júlia Steck, of the Steck Arquitetura firm in Campinas. While restoring this property, we're going to generate 4 studios, 4 apartments with exclusive bathroom and a small kitchen for all the families we're going to house. We truthfully call this project a village because each apartment is going to have its own exclusive area, and they're going to share a room, a laundry, and the kitchen. We also have a commercial area that's going to be the headquarter of our project, and we can share that with a leaser. This is the upstairs of the property. We have the original 1929 property, and then an annex that was made in 2008. So we have one more housing up here. The house has a high right foot, so we are leveraging this right foot with one more area where we have either a bed or a playing area. This is a few more images of the executive project. We are starting the work this week, the demolitions of some parts that we need to remove from the property. And so to complete how the financing of the first property worked, we created an NGO that's going to manage the rent and the properties, and it created a specific purpose company with social investors that added quotas to that company so we could purchase the first property. It cost 160,000 reais, and the work is estimated in 80,000 reais. We are receiving donations, cash donations, and as you saw in the video, we promote cultural events to raise funds for the project and to promote the artists in our city, in our region that suffered a lot with the pandemic as well. Some artists made half of a minimum wage during the pandemic. So it is a high social vulnerability situation. We want to help them in our project too. So what I wanted to share with you to complete is the project for one property requires a pretty big management. We need funds because housing is the most expensive social good. And working with heritage, we know the cost of a restoration work is a lot more than just refurbishing because we need to be careful with product and project decisions so the cultural good is effectively preserved. And in Brazil, we have a structural problem. We have never had policies within the housing that would privilege social rents and the preservation of heritage in central areas, and also the preservation. We don't have much financing and policies to finance housing, especially social housing and heritage. So we have a huge property stock in the city centers without any public policies to contemplate that problem. So our association is a possibility, obviously. We don't have scale to solve the public policy issue as a whole, but we present ourselves as a possibility of partnership to the public authorities to implement such policies. We have already discussed with the municipality, including the mayor and secretaries, to discuss potential fundings for this kind of policy and also legal instruments and financial instruments to help and finance this policy. The public authorities has always said that it's hard for them to make this policy because it's very costly and generates few housings. So it is much more on the quality rather than quantity policy. If we don't use uh, the cultural heritage as something important for the city, we would be unable to advance this debate. So just wanted to share with you part of our experience and let me know if you have any questions. Hope you can follow us on our social networks. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and we have a website where we gather and dig deeper on the information and work we've been developing. Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa, for this initiative and for your presentation that shows how challenging it is to innovate in housing policies. It was a pretty wealthy table with different examples regarding the challenge of discussing housing, how to live in a heritage, how to occupy those spaces. There are many possibilities that, for me, in my opinion, we have to challenge heritage. Discussing housing is particularly important for us to face what Patricia has already discussed, the authorized discourse of heritage, coined by larger means, structured in the 60s, consolidated in the 70s, and then in the 80s, after the Berlin Wall, that allows some institutions to determine what we can call the heritage with uh, with caps. So this contesting this questioning this heritage allowed for entities, organized civil society, to place themselves against what is considered to be heritage, and they can say what is eventually what we think, or what we can say that heritage, or for whom heritage is, and what is the use of selective practice of heritage. So this term that Daniel Fabri talks about so well, that's why the transnational dialogues are so important, because we're talking about contexts where we have several possibilities to question and understand heritage as a right, and this isn't always possible. And I wanted to say that housing doesn't look like a privileged field. I've been saying this for a long time. And we have to think how the appropriations of locals and social beings and the projects can face this heritage discourse. So Mike discussed the metropolises and local scale, and how the local scale will have to be mobilized in the future context of uh, heritage in big urban centers. Patricia and Roberto discussed modern housing in the 20th century in the Chile and the Mozambique contexts. And then we talked about activism, and we wrapped up with the ACT project, housing that allows us to build public policies for housing. So we had a pretty interesting discussion today. We want to continue the discussion on a seminar next year. I want to take the opportunity to invite everyone. We are organizing ourselves to think and set up the seminar. And I want to pass the floor. I know I have a few minutes left. If someone has any questions, or a particular question to Monica, if someone wants to make comments, we have 7 more minutes to talk. If you have any questions, let us know. If someone wants to add information to their presentations, feel free. I think Monica made a comment and a question. I'm going to read 2 comments by Monica and Antonio.
Coloca na ordem do dia questões relacionadas à permanência
The housing shortage in big cities in Brazil and other parts of the world, especially for the poorest people, brings issues related to the preexistence of social groups in central areas, as well as social environmental conflicts in protected territories. What challenging principles can you see in your countries? And Brazil's legislation is very important when it supports innovative housing in the 1988 Constitution. It acknowledges the right to housing in a natural and cultural context. And why can we not make it happen? We had many comments thanking for the presentations and congratulating the initiatives and all the discussions we had on today's table. So I'm going to pass the floor to today's speakers for their comments and answer the questions as you deem possible,
como eu estou no celular, eu não consigo necessariamente ver todo
I like
mundo.
to follow the same order as the presenters. I can see everyone here. If Monica can help me.
Eu vejo a Vanessa.
I see Vanessa.
Aqui está todo mundo. A gente está. Eu acho que tem o Mike, eu não sei, Patrícia.
We have Patricia, Mike, and then Humberto, Rui. Patricia, if you would like to make any comments.
E depois eu vou na ordem das apresentações, por favor.
Começo eu ou seguimos a ordem das apresentações?
Can I start?
Seguimos a ordem. Por favor, depois eu passo para o Mike e aí na ordem.
Ok. Bom, respondendo um bocadinho à pergunta da Mônica, não sei
So
se...
just answering Monica's question, not sure if I understood well, the main challenges for reuse of buildings. Here in Mozambique, nearly without thinking, buildings are being reused, especially when it comes to modern housing. There is a very small stock of buildings after using Vanessa's example, but the big problem is collective housing buildings. It is hard to find the way to manage those buildings collectively. Most of the population comes from different social layers, so a lot of heterogeneity.
Financiar coletivamente.
It's hard for them to collectively finance the management, and that's the biggest difficulty. In many buildings, the painting of the inside of the building is, those who can, those who are able to afford, they will paint their floor or the part around their house, and the rest of the building is still without any paint. So these collective management ways, that's very hard, especially when issues are more important when it comes to the constructive building of the places. Thank you, Patricia. Would anyone else like to make comments? Mike has raised his hand, and then Vanessa.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think it is beyond adaptive reuse. I think we're not coming to grips with the large numbers which Vanessa presented to us, and that's global. So I think that we have to be careful that we're not organizing the deck chairs on the top deck of the Titanic. And I think that what we need to do is then discuss what is then urban infill. We need to have something which is going to change the centers of our cities. What is the option, therefore, of peri-urban additions around the city? And where are we going to have new cities completely? Are we going to have another Brasilia somewhere? And I think that these are the major questions. And we also have to bear in mind that the architecture of today will be the heritage of tomorrow. Over.
Obrigada, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. Vanessa, and then if someone wants to add a comment, can I comment? Yes, there's a specific question for you. Well, the question Monica raised is what we have been facing for many years now. What are the challenges? The challenges are plenty of them, and they are immense. This year, I can talk about one challenge for each group. For us in the academia, and we are researchers, Mike has as well highlighted by Mike, we need to disclose those moments. We need to research what's going on in the city centers and publish. Press likes to disclose this information. The information I presented about Campinas, they haven't been published yet. We are completing an article to publish even the georeferenced information and so on. An important challenge of the academia is to research and monitor that information from housing, the ociousity, and the forgotten heritage in our central areas. The challenge for civil society would be to try to organize itself to do something, as we're trying to do in the ASH Association. It's not easy. It is hard to manage. And our biggest challenge as civil society is funds. As much as we can mobilize, we were able to mobilize 170,000 reais in 1 month to buy that property. But we are intensively mobilizing to get funds for the refurbishment. For us, that we are workers, we aren't entrepreneurs, we don't have that much money. The number of resources we need to mobilize for this action is quite hard to achieve. Public authorities have money in Brazil. I worked in municipalities for 8 years. I advise city halls. I know they have money. We restored, we spent 8 million in 8 years. It's very little. It would be like $2 million or so. So we can do a lot with little money if we have a good management. The problem for public authorities is not about money, it's management. We need to have an effective program that will design a coupled solution with heritage and housing in the central area, and we should have partnerships. That's what we are hopeful to see as a support for the management, because since the city hall finds it hard to manage, the public authorities in general, we want to present ourselves not as a solution, but as supporter for us to implement the policies. That's what I would highlight. On the research, academia, for academic research, that brings light to the reality. In civil society, we have to organize ourselves to do that and mobilize resources from the civil society as a challenge and provoke public authorities to come up with programs. So that's what I have to say. Perfect, Vanessa. Thank you. Well, I think I just want to remind you of the other question Antonio has asked. Yeah, I can answer him. It's a very important question and has to do with everything we're discussing. We really need that we will have the federal constitution, the 1988 constitution, that acknowledges the right to housing, to heritage, but the application of public policies, of what is written in the constitution, this is the big gap. We have public policies that are not applied as they should be, and we have gaps, as Vanessa said. We don't have a public policy that is sectorial and that works on housing and heritage. There is a gap there. At the same time, the state doesn't take any action. Last year in Brazil, we had a pretty hard and complex situation, which was making buildings belong to the state available, as we say here. Public goods, they were made available for private use. On a moment that we are discussing housing, the need, this decent housing, well living. So public buildings We use it for private matters or shops and purposes other than housing.
Aos bens públicos, né, que podem ser utilizados para moradia e pode reduzir bastante o déficit que nós temos. Então,
And this can reduce our deficit.
no momento com essa necessidade,
So
necessidade emergente.
they're not talking to the emerging necessities.
Aí a sociedade civil está mostrando como se pode fazer, como se pode.
And civil society is showing how we can do this, how we can change all the issues we have in front of us, using this stock that is not being used, is being underused for how, especially for housing. And the pandemic brought another issue. We realized that the form of housing and work can be different, can be more fluid. So the central areas of the main cities were emptied. Even though work has been resumed, those areas are empty, and we need to work on those areas. We need to have a specific policy for the central areas, especially the big metropolis. We've been discussing all the goals, sustainability. This is on our hand, but the state isn't doing anything effectively. This is the path, Antonio, answering your question. And we have another serious issue. They think of government policy, not a state policy. Housing, heritage is the identity of a people. This is a state policy, a continued one. So there is a certain perversion of the way the state has been working when it comes to health, housing, heritage, public housing. This is very important. Hope I answered your question, Antonio. I think we have one more question for Toledo. Toledo, welcome. Glad to see you here. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm not sure if you read it. What is the role of the favela in the Rio de Janeiro context? I do think so. You know, when we made the Rocinha project,
que deviam ser o patrimônio histórico e arquitetônico da Rocinha. Então, tinha uma espécie
so you have some kind of special path within the favela there's an example of architecture that would mark the occupation. I understand that in Rio favelas, a number of architecture examples that should be kept. And the favela as a whole is like a village, another type of urbanization. Rocinha's urbanization is different from other Rio favelas.
Tomarem nas mãos o seu próprio destino e ocuparem um
This
lugar.
would allow them to take care of their own destination, of their own fate.
São verdadeiras cidades que foram criadas como exemplo da
So cities were created
população de baixa renda de tomar o seu próprio destino nas
with the low income population.
capitalista, não tem a menor vocação de fazer isso, nem interesse. Então, eu entendo que a favela, como já
So I
está,
understand that the favela, the way it is an example of the possibility for people to grab their own fate on hands. And this is a cultural good that is inestimable
nesse momento de capitalismo que a gente está vivendo.
in this moment of capitalism we're going through. It is an example, a role.
Mas é um exemplo do que foi possível fazer.
I'm not saying we have to follow it, but what could be done against all and against everyone. Thank you.
Toledo, muito obrigada.
Thank you, Toledo. I pass the floor to Rui Leão. Please, Rui. Thank you. So, on the first questions made by Monica and Antonio, to Monica and Antonio, I'd like to say that in Asia we live on a completely different context. So, this project that is super interesting that Vanessa and her collective are doing, it would be really impossible to think of this context as a market, as a property market totally inaccessible to families. But what has to do with the differences? The most important is to reoccupy heritage the way it is, because this heritage occupation is that allows for people in general to be close, look, and feel a relationship not only of belonging or identity, but also of understanding of the steps that they are directly part of their lives. In this context, in Macau, there's a policy that was very important. Was the occupation of palaces and heritage buildings for public services with public service. This allowed for the Chinese population that had some distance regarding the heritage that was left from the colonial period, so it could be taken over on a good manner, because when we talk about patrimony about heritage since 2013, this is to be implemented and put into practice when there is a sense of identity and affirmation of the population in general regarding patrimony and what is heritage. And only with that work, the work that Vanessa and collectives such as the one she does, but other kinds of intervention, we have to be able to creatively reoccupy the old city and create an organization, a participative organization that can create and occupy new context for that architecture. That's the first step. to be able to safeguard heritage as policy. As said, as well said by Noemia, government has policies for identity.
Obrigada, Rui. A gente já
Thank you, Rui.
tinha avançado da hora.
I know that time.
Há uma pergunta que foi feita pela Alexandra. Por gentileza, Vanessa.
Alexandra, obrigada pela pergunta. Bom, a gente definiu primeiro o perfil, né, das famílias que a gente...
First, we define the profile of the families that we think it is important to serve on the That's why we got to families that are headed by women. So we said that the families need to have between 1 and 2 kids, headed by women between 1.5 minimum wage. And then we started talking with several collectives of the city, collectives of maids, of neighborhood associations, of favelas in Campinas. We started talking to leaderships, including an association that houses women in a situation of domestic violence. And we started mapping out those collectives and talking to them. We didn't start selecting the families yet because we don't want to cause any anxiety on them because they need housing now. And we're starting the works. So first started mapping and talking to them. And then on the second moment, when the refurbishment is being completed, we can interview those people that want to live, and we present them the property. They will share some areas of the property. Not everyone will accept, although they are vulnerable, even though it's a kitchen or laundry. This is going to be clear. We're going to present the project, and the dynamics are going to be pretty clear. If they want to, feel free to join this election or not. This is a process that we are still starting. The Fundo Fica in São Paulo, I selected for 4 housings, has helped us a lot in this process, how to talk to families and how to select them. And the public authorities who discussed, we had 3 meetings with the municipality and we asked them a few instruments to be regulated in Campinas, the Abandon Institute, for example, a possibility for the City Hall to release a partnership with entities like ours that is concerned about providing social housing, in preferably cultural interest properties. And City Hall is studying this topic to see if we can change scale in a few years in a partnership with the City Hall. Thank you, Vanessa. Unfortunately, I have to wrap up our table. I want to thank our speakers for the very clarifying, inspiring talks. I want to thank Flávia Brito and Noema Barradas for moderating this table, the transmission, coordinated by José Landi, and interpreters coordinated by Carlos Abelheira, and all our listeners as well. And all those that asked questions interacted with us. Thank you, and we will timely let you know about the release of some publications regarding those tables. So, one more time, thank you, and I want to congratulate all of you. Thank you. Hope I'll see you soon. Bye.